Hi, Tim Clapham here for the c4d215 course, week 2 for FX PhD. And this week we're going to be looking at type again. We're going to be working just with one letter, and I want to kind of treat this class as if it was a project that you might actually work on in the real world. So we're going to have a look at the assets that the client would send us, how the brief might change, and how we can accommodate these things and look at some of the pitfalls. So it's going to start off fairly simple and hopefully get a little bit more complex towards the end. Now, the type that we're going to be creating will be like flowing type, where we can flow type along a spline or a path of some kind. And rather than look at doing a whole word, we're just going to work with one letter. So that could be like a monogram, or it could be a logo. So if we just jump over to Illustrator here, you can see that we've got some artwork created. I'm going to imagine this is the artwork that the client has sent us, and this is their monogram or their logo. And we're going to animate this. Now, I'll give you the Illustrator CC file so you can see I've set this up, but if I just switch to outlines, you can see that this middle R here uses a variable width, and then on the final one here I've just made that editable or expanded the appearance. But you can see that the mesh wrong program, that the paths that it's created are really messy. There are points all over the place, and this is pretty much typical of the kind of junk that you get sent in this industry, that you have to either redraw, which isn't too taxing for something like this, or have to work out some other way to work with this file. I've also drawn a path here, which is essentially the key line, or the central line through this shape, and we can use that in Cinema to our advantage. So let's jump over to Cinema 4D and we can get started with building this our logo. Here in Cinema 4D, let's choose File, Merge Objects from the Object Manager, and let's locate the Illustrator file. Now there's two that I've sent out, but we need to open the version 8 file. If we open that up, I'm just going to leave it with the scale at 1. And if we just zero out these coordinates so that we have this in the center of our world, fold this down, you can see we've got our 4 splines. So we can call this R long, R short. Okay, and let's just disable those two for now. Let's just grab path 1 here, hold down the Alt key, let's add in a loft. Let's grab path 2 and add in another loft. Okay, and if we just select these two, press Alt G to group them, and we can call this our loft group, or whatever you want to call it, and drag that out. If we just switch over to constant or quick shading lines, we can see what an absolute mess this has made. Now if we didn't need to do anything to this and just leave it as a simple flat artwork, then the job's done, but it's very unlikely that that's the case. And really, looking at the topology of this, you're not going to be able to do too much with it. You could enable regular grid for caps, and maybe it will deform and stuff like that, but here you can see we've got these really long triangles. But we can use this in the process. Because we know this artwork represents the artwork from the client, we can use it as a guide, for instance. So I'm actually just going to put that to world 0. Let's grab these two. Let's switch to the basic tab, and let's just make these red or something, just so that we can differentiate between the different elements. And if we come to our front view, let's just grab these, come in and just line them up with our mesh that we already created, something like so. And now if we add in a null, let's call this R splines, and drag these two into here. We can get rid of that null we already had, and I've just done it like that just so that these are all at world 0. Now the brief from the client is to create a 3D version of this logo that they may or they may not want to animate it later on. You know, one of those ambiguous briefs where they just want it to look cool. Okay, so let's see what we can do about that. The first thing I think we should do is to take this spline and make it more 3D. So let's take the long spline and switch to points mode, and let's just do something really simple, like pull this out here. Let's pull that one back. Maybe pull this out a little bit. Something like so, just so that we have a little bit of a twist to it all. Nothing too outrageous. And if we just do the same with the short spline, we can do this from the side view perhaps. Maybe something like so. Okay, I just want to make sure that this part here is actually passing through there. Maybe we'll just pull that back a little bit. Okay. So there's nothing too groundbreaking, but really I just want to get on and show you the various techniques. If you want to spend more time, design your own, then by all means do. Let's start by making the short section here, because that's going to be the simplest. And to do this, I'm going to add in a plain object first of all. Let's call this r_01. And if we switch to the Object tab, I'm not really sure exactly what size I want it to be, but I probably want it to be maybe 50 wide and say 400 long. I'm going to leave 2 width segments. Now we could add in a bend deformer to give it an interesting shape here, but let's try and keep this class fairly simple so we can get through it. And I'm going to say +Z. So there we have our R short. Let's pull this down so it's below our splines, because I'm going to now hold down Shift and add in a spline wrap. And let's call this spline wrap RS01. And the spline that we want to attach this to, of course, is the R short spline. So let's drop that on. And you can see that it's not looking quite right, but we just need to adjust the axes. So if we just set this to be +Y, and you can see that that's now fitting along the spline. But I want to just change that because I want to change the mode from fit spline to keep length. And the reason for that is because if we animate the offset, we need it to be a certain length so that we can slide it off the spline, or if we make the spline longer, which we will do later, we need to maintain the length of this plane object. So you can see it's actually too long, so we can come to the height and we can just pull this back, and it's going to be somewhere around there. So let's just say 300 for the sake of keeping everything uniform. Let's unhide our loft, come to our front view, and let's just come in and have a look at this. I'm going to just hide that spline wrap for a moment so that that doesn't interfere. And let's just fold this down so we can see all of our parameters. Now at the moment with my spline wrap, you can see these are all folded down, but maybe yours will be closed like so. But let's just fold that down. And you can adjust the actual size of our deformed object. And you can see as I do that, it changes here. So if we grab this, pull this down, grab the handle, and then let's grab this end and pull it down, grab this handle. And it's probably a good idea actually to come in here and make these a different color as well. Let's make those red. And now when we grab this, we can see if it's lining up correctly with the loft. So you might want to tweak these a little bit. I think that what we probably want to do here is make the whole thing a bit thinner. So let's set this to say 35. Now we've got a little bit more control because we can pull this graph up higher and it won't get too wide. And you can see that we then can kind of mess around with these. Now I'm not going to spend hours doing this. If you were actually trying to match this logo, then you definitely would spend a fair bit of time getting that exactly right. If we come back to our main view, I'm going to set this loft so it doesn't render, and if we just render now, you can see, there we go, we can see the result. So that one's fairly quick and easy to do. So let's grab this and call this one R short, or R long even, R long 01, and we'll call this RL01 just so we know which is which. First thing to do is to swap the spline, so let's grab the long spline and drop that into there. Let's come to our front view and have a look. And I'm just going to right click on this parameter and choose reset to default. So now of course we need to adjust the height of our R long. So let's just increase this, and you can see as we do that it travels around the spline. It's getting pretty chunky here. We definitely don't have enough segments. In fact, you can see that we can see all the segments on the short one as well, so perhaps we should increase them there. So let's select the short plane first of all, and let's set the height segments. Well, actually I'll leave that at 40. Let's select this long one and we can set that to be quite a lot higher, maybe 120 or something, and there you go. You can see that smooths that out. Let's just hide these lofts for a moment, and there you go, and you can see there's our R all starting to take place. Not looking very spectacular at the moment. And now we can come in, we can grab this, and we're going to need to pull this one down too. Let's come to our front view. Okay, and then what we probably want to do is add another one in the middle here. And you can see that as you move this around, you can adjust whereabouts it's going thin, and we probably want another one here and here. Let's pull these up. And that's going to be something like so. There we go. And then if we just pull this so we can see it, and I'm doing this fairly quickly. You guys are going to be, if this is a real job, obviously you wouldn't do each of these in a matter of minutes. You'd spend a bit more time and make sure it was as perfect as possible. But this gives you a pretty good idea of the process. If you render that now, there you go, you can see that's starting to take shape. And obviously these, you know, it's not as smooth as it could be there. But not to worry, I think that is absolutely fine for the process that we're going through. I think this is where the problem is there. There we go. Let's just adjust that slightly. Okay. Next, if we add in a null, and let's just call this logo, grab these two, drop them into here. Now if we select this logo, hold down the Alt key, come up to simulate, let's add in a cloth surface, and then hold down Alt and let's add in a subdivision surface or a hyperNURBS, depending on which version you're using. And let's come to our display and set that to quick shading. So what we can do on the cloth NURBS is set our subdivisions to 0, and we can add a little bit of thickness on here, and this will just give us a really nice look without having to spend too much time modeling it. And you can see now when we render it, we're getting these kind of nice soft edge. It's a really quick way of just creating something a little bit interesting. Of course, with the spline wrap, if we want, we can come in here, we have rotation, we can come down, and we could rotate this slightly. If you want it to rotate the other way, maybe, add a little bit more interest to the model. So this is all well and good. We've created this. It's all working pretty well. A lot of you probably thinking, well, that's easy. I know how to do that already. But now the client comes back to you and they say, well, what we actually want to do is we want to animate this. We want to animate it so that as if this is flowing along a ribbon and then it forms into place. That's all well and good. That's still, again, not too tricky, but there are a few pitfalls that you need to be aware of. Included with the download, there was also a Cinema 4D file which is called Extended Splines, and to save us drawing these paths in the class, I've just drawn them for you, and of course you can create them yourself. We could just grab this and then hold down Control and add some more points. You may want to drag when you do that, and then of course you're going to need to manipulate these so that they're all moving correctly to where your camera is, and we haven't added a camera either. So rather than going through that process in the class, let's just open up the file that was included in the download called Extended Splines. In this file you can see we have a camera which is currently active. Let's switch to the editor cam, and here you can see we've got a couple of splines, and it's the R that we had before, but they've just simply been extended to pass back, you know, kind of behind the camera. Not particularly elegant, but enough to demonstrate the concepts that we're going to go through next. So let's just grab all of these elements, and then I'm going to copy those, close this down, and I can then paste them into here. Grab these two splines and let's just put them into this splines null so everything's grouped together, and let's switch to the active camera. Now I'm going to just come down here and I'm going to leave these and just Control drag both to create duplicates, and let's call these O2 and fold them down, and let's just rename the spline wraps to 2 as well. And then at the end of this class, you'll have a file with all the solutions in one place, and we can just control click on here to disable the object and all of its children, so that now we're working with our version 2. So if we grab spline wrap RS02, instead of using the short spline, we'll use the short extended. And if we grab our long 02 spline wrap and put the long extended spline in there, okay, and you can see it changed very slightly. There is a little bit of a difference there, so we would probably want to adjust that. So now what we can do is we can come to our offset and we can animate the offset, and notice that what happens is that the spline comes in, lands in place. Lovely. And if we grab the other spline wrap, let's have a look at this, and if we pull this back, you can see that we get this effect. Now, one of the problems with this, I mean, this isn't working too badly, but if you had a more intricate shape or a longer path, then maybe it would become a little bit more noticeable. But if we come to our editor cam and have a look, you can see that where we've adjusted the ribbon, it's kept that. So it's really thin here, it's pointy at the end, it's fatter here. It's got all of those irregularities along that spline as it travels along the path. Now, if we had several shots and we were showing our ribbon flowing in any previous shots, then we probably wouldn't want it to look like that. We'd probably want this size to be reset. So let's set our offset to 0, come back to our camera. Let's work with the short part of the R first, because that's the simplest. So I'm going to select that spline wrap, right click on the size parameter and just reset that to default, so we're back with this chunky thing. So instead of that, this time I'm going to use spline size, so we can adjust the size of this object along the length of the spline. So if we pull this down here, or if we pull the other side, you can see the difference. So this side, it's affecting nearly the whole of that object, starting from here, coming here, and it's starting to get a bit thicker. And as it comes all the way to the end of this spline, if we animate the offset, you can see it gets thicker towards the end. Great stuff. So what we really need to do is to pull this up, something like so, and we need to then take this along and then down here and pull it up like so. And let's just unhide our loft group and switch to our front view so we can try and make this match our logo. Now the thing is, it's quite difficult to control this little graph, so we can right click in here and choose show in separate window, and this will then bring up a nice big floating dialogue. And obviously I haven't got as much screen space in this capture area, but this is still very, very helpful. And you can see we now have a lot more control over the accuracy of our graph. So there we go. So I think we've done this one now, but of course this isn't really a great solution, because if we grab our offset, what's going to happen is as we animate this along here, you can see that it's like wafer thin. We can't see it. We need it to be thick here. So what do we do? Obviously we've got this point here. We could then add in another point here. But then you've got this weird part here, and obviously that's to do with the fact that we've got this where it goes negative into negative values here. But whatever happens, you're still going to get this point where it goes thin here, so we need to find some way of resolving that. Let's just leave it as it is for now. Okay, and let's set our offset back to 0. I'm going to do the same with the spline wrap 02. So first of all, let's reset size. Let's come down to our spline size, and we can pull this end down to create the point here. But you can see obviously this is quite a long spline, so that thin part lasts for ages. So we need to pull this up, and I'm going to just open this in a separate window so I can see what I'm doing a lot more clearly. Switch to my front view. Let's just pull out slightly. Let's grab the other point and pull this down and across, and we want to just see, you can see as I move it, now it's somewhere around here, so we need to just adjust this so that if we pull that up like so, now if we just adjust the position of this till it kind of reaches there, Now that's looking pretty good. So now we can pull this up. We can pull this one up. But you can see that what happens here is it's going to the thickest point here. So we're going to need to just control click on here and just add in another 3 points, just as we did before. And let's just do this pretty quickly. Pull this down. So it's somewhere around there. This is looking pretty bad, that curve. Okay. Just need to pull that across. Maybe make that a bit shorter. Okay, you can see that it's a little bit fussy, and it's a good job we've got this window and makes it slightly easier. Let's just adjust where that should be, somewhere around there. And then this one, of course, needs to be much fatter for the top of the R. And there we go. So again, not perfect, but should be good enough for this class, and you get the idea. There we go. So there we go. So now we have our spline wrap part 2. To really see the effect of this, we need to animate these into place. This is what the clients asked for. So let's come to the very end. Actually, let's set this to be 99 frames, so it's 4 seconds all in. And you can see that my graph isn't very accurate here, but no worries. Let's select both of these spline wraps and set the offset to 0 and add a key by control clicking on this dot. Come to the beginning. Let's grab our let's grab the short 02 and let's just animate that offset. Okay, and you can just see. So it needs to go to about, well, let's just say 100. Let's grab the long one and let's animate this to be 100. Okay. Come back to our perspective view. Let's hide the loft group. Let's hide the splines and let's just hit play and have a look. We don't really see a lot, and then it kind of forms the R's. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just select both of these, press Control and hit space, and that will bring me into my F curves, but by holding down Control it will have these two selected. And I just want to select this first key and just pull that down, and if we just frame that curve, you can see that it's basically going to just be one really long ease at the end, so it just eases into place. So what we need to do is we need to change this graph, and we can animate this graph. So if we come to the end and we have both of those spline wraps selected, we can add a key for our spline size. Now let's select the short one first of all, and let's just come back to say frame 75, maybe a little bit before, around 60. Let's grab this point on this graph and let's pull it all the way over to here, make it flat, and let's just put that up like so. So it's something like so. So this is the very beginning of the spline, and now you can see it's the full width. And if you look at the result, we've now got the full width of our ribbon. If we add a key now, and as we drag across, that spline animates and the shape will animate into place. But for the rest of it, you can see we've now got this nice ribbon that's clearly visible. So we need to do the same for our long spline. We've added one key already. Let's come back to, say, frame 60. And now we need to flatten all of these out. So we could just, drag this down. Let's drag this across. And this is obviously pretty heavy-handed, but it doesn't really matter. We just want it to almost be the full height all the way along. And then let's just add a key here. Now you might want to adjust the timing of this so it happens slightly earlier or later, but you can see now again. It didn't. Not sure what happened there. Seem to have lost my spline. Great. Okay, for some reason it's not animating all of the points. Looks like maybe we found a bug there, but let's just Control Shift click on here to get rid of all of those keys. this spline is messed up. Luckily, if I just save incremental, I believe I can go back to a previous version. Okay, so this is an older version of the file, and hopefully you've been saving along. We can copy this spline now, and then we can close that down, and we should be able to come back here and actually paste identical. There we go. So now we've got that back, which is pretty lucky. If you are following along with this, I would advise to save before you animate this. I'm not sure why it didn't work. Maybe it was because I had 2 spline wraps selected when I added the first key, but let's just try that again. So this is what we want it to look like at the end. Let's add a key. Let's come back to frame 60, and now let's bring all of these values up. Okay. Something like so. Let's add another key, and now let's just drag and see, and there we go. And that's what it should have done. If you watch the graph. Okay. So there we go. So now we have both our ribbons coming in, and then at this point here it morphs into the R shape. Now of course you might want to adjust the timing of that. If we come down here and have a look at all of these parameters that we get for that spline, it's pretty full on, but you can select them and then press H, and there you go, you can see all of those. I'm not going to worry about adjusting the curves for those. Don't have time for those kind of things in this class. So that's looking great. You see, you can think, all right, cool, well let's just fine tune that timing, let's just send that to the client. I think that what we really need to do is come to here and let's just frame our project settings. I'm going to grab these keys and I'm just going to pull them down to around there, just so it all happens a bit quicker and we can see the logo resolve. Everything's happening a bit slow. The timing needs a lot of tweaking, but there you go, you get the idea. So cool, so you send that off to your client. Client come back, said, oh yeah, this is great, but we're not really happy that both of the splines are coming from the bottom of the screen. It'd be nice if maybe one of them came from the top right, just to make the whole thing a bit more dynamic and a bit more of an interesting composition. So you think, okay, fair enough, let's just save this and we can have a look at how to change that. It shouldn't be too much of a problem. Now I've saved incremental, but just to keep everything all in one file and working, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the long extended and just dupe that and call this long extended 02. And let's just call that 01 so we know what's what. And then let's just grab our long, I'm only going to work on the long part of the R for now. And let's just create a version here and we call this 03. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just drag in this spline. It's exactly the same at the moment, so we shouldn't see any difference. Everything still works. So now if we select this spline, make it visible, we're in points mode. So what we want to do is, let's just come to our front view. Let's just grab, in fact, let's just switch to F5 so we can see all views. Let's just pull this up here and perhaps just adjust that angle. Okay. Okay, so maybe that will do. You know, maybe we just want to tweak that a little bit, bring it up. So there we've got our new spline shape. If we drag, everything seems to be fine. I think that's actually an illusion. If we take our long 02 and let's just control click to get rid of that so we can only see this. Now interestingly enough, we can't see too much change in here, but the one thing that I did want to show you, so I might have to be a bit more extreme, there we go, is if we start manipulating the spline, then what's going to happen is that it's going to affect our R. See how as I move and make this spline different lengths, the R is changing. So if the client asks for a bit more of a radical change than the one that I just made, let's pull this out here and let's pull this back somewhat and bring that spline a bit longer. So this is our new path. Okay, and you can see now that what's happened here is that the R is changing, and we've added keys on this spline as well. So if we come to this point here and we select our spline wrap, we're going to need to adjust this. I only need to really adjust one point in this example, so we're quite lucky, but maybe we need to just adjust this, just bring it back a bit. Oh, now it's looking a bit messy in the middle. Oh, there we go, that looks a bit more like it. You know, and then you can go, okay, well there we go, so we've done that now. If you had a whole bunch of letters and a whole bunch of these, and you had to adjust all of those splines for each one, every time the client or you wanted to make a change, say you just want to adjust these spline at will, you just want to experiment with some different paths and see how it looks. Every time you move that spline around, it's going to mess up the look of your R at the end. I just manipulated it all then, but I forgot to add a key. Again, bit of a duh moment, but quite frustrating when you're up against a deadline and things keep changing. So maybe there are other options rather than using these graphs in the spline wrap itself. What other ways could we achieve a similar result? An alternative approach to solving this issue might be to actually morph our geometry into place as it moves along the spline. So rather than using this graph down here to adjust the size of our object along the spline, we just reset this and we add in a morph, and then we can just slide into that morph target as the R ends up in place. Let's take the R long 03, just control drag to create a duplicate and disable that. And we'll call this 04, and we'll call this spline wrap 04 as well. So with that spline wrap, let's right click on the spline size, choose animation, delete track, and then let's choose reset to default. So now we don't have any size adjustment along this, but we should still have our animation. So as this comes along here, and you can see that I haven't drawn the spline very well there, but never mind. And as it lands in place at this point here, we'd like to actually morph this to the shape of our logo. So we need to create a morph target first of all. So let's just take our, in fact what we can do is if we unhide this group here and we switch these lofts off, we have our two splines. And if we come to the front view, let's just make sure these splines are hidden. And I'm going to just hide this short one for a moment, and also hide my camera just so that the viewport is a little bit clearer. And let's hide this spline. Now one of the problems here of course is that this object is a parametric object. As soon as we want to add morphs to it, if we're going to move the points around, we need to convert this into a polygon object. So that's a disadvantage of using this technique for sure. Let's switch off our cloth surface and our subdivision surface, and let's set the display here to be wireframe. Now with this object, I'm going to change that to say 60, just so that we have less points to move. And now what we can do is we can press C to make this editable. And if we right click on here and choose character tags and add in a pose morph. Next thing is to enable points, and we need to switch to points mode. Now you notice that my object stays deformed even though I've switched over to points mode. Yours may not do that. Yours may jump back to being a straight plane object, and this depends on a setting that we'll need to change to facilitate this. So if we press Shift V to bring up our configurations, and we switch to display, under here we have this parameter deformed editing. If I uncheck that, you can see that my object becomes undeformed. It's now back to component mode. We're in point mode and there's no deformation taking place, but we really need to see our object in its deformed state to work with it. So you need to make sure that deformed editing is enabled first of all under your viewport display configurations. So let's just first of all enable deformed editing. Now if we come to our pose morph tag, you can see that we've got our base pose, which is the initial pose before we've done anything to it, and we've got a new pose that's been added, and this is our first morph target. So if we double click on this, and we'll call this R pose, and now what we should be able to do is we should be able to come over here, grab these points and pull them around. But if we grab one and move it, you can see now we're getting this really weird result, which is definitely not very helpful. So let's undo. Now the reason it's doing that is because the spline wrap works on the bounding box of the object, and as soon as we start moving these points around, we can change the size of that bounding box. So that in turn ripples down through and affects the deformation. So what we have to do first of all is select our spline wrap. If we scroll to the very bottom here, we have an option called bounding box. Now the labeling on this may be different depending on the version of Cinema 4D you're using, but it's at the very bottom of the Object tab. Unfold that, and there's an option called Fix Bounding Box. If we enable that, the bounding box is then fixed, and if we adjust the points on the object, the bounding box doesn't change, and then the deformation doesn't change. So now if we come to here, let's make sure we've got our pose morph tag selected, and we have our pose selected. We can grab these points, and we can move them around. So everything's starting to work. But you notice that as I move this, the point doesn't really follow my cursor. In fact, it doesn't follow it at all. We're getting really odd, spurious results. Now the reason for that is because the pose morph tag doesn't really realize that our object is deformed. So it's perhaps looking at the matrices of the original points. And that's why as we move it around, because it's deformed, the point doesn't move where we want it to be. So it all gets a little bit confusing. Luckily, the pose morph tag has an option that will allow us to use morphs after deformers, and that's this option here, post deformers. And what we're actually really going to do is we're going to create like what's called a correctional morph, because we want to correct our shape, and we're going to do this after the deformers. So we enable post deformers. Now we should be able to come down, and now as I move that point around, you can see everything's behaving exactly as it should. So now all we have to do is we have to go in and move all of these points. We can do this fairly quickly, believe it or not, because we already have either some geometry, which we could create from these previously deformed objects, or in this example here, we have our splines. And you can see that we've got these two splines here, and if we come down to our object, let's just press P and enable snap. Now at the moment it's set to auto snapping, which means that if we're in a perspective view it will be a 3D snap, but we're actually in a 2D view, our front view, so it's going to be a 2D snap, and that's quite important because we don't really want to lose that lovely overlap that we have here. If we do a full 3D snap to that spline, the whole thing will suddenly become really flat. So we're going to do that from a 2D view, and the next thing we need to do is press P again, and we need to enable spline snapping. Now the alternative, as I say, is to take one of these objects such as the R long, enable this, and then do a current state to object, and you could then snap to that, or you could even use that as a relative morph target. Let's just do this the way that I've mentioned, using snapping, and now what we can do is we can come in and we can grab these points, and yeah, this is a little bit of a laborious process, especially if you've got a lot of these to do. But it's definitely one of the solutions that could work depending on the project that you're doing and some of the problems that you may be having. So what I'm going to do is, rather than sit here and make you watch, I'm going to just do one little section of it first of all, like so. If we then grab our pose morph, we should be able to grab this slider, and you can see how that's now going to morph into place. So we need to, as it animates along the spline, for the last sort of few frames, we can then bring that in, and it will then move into the correct position. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through and I'm going to continue to snap all of these points onto this spline, so that at the end of it I've got the whole shape correct as my morph target. So just bear with me one moment and then I will be right back. Okay, so the morph is done fairly quickly, and it takes a few minutes when you've got snapping, and you can see that now we've got this morph, so we can morph to our shape. I haven't actually checked this in the 3D view, but you can see there we go. So the snapping worked pretty well. It looks a bit odd here. You know, maybe we just want to fix that up, and at the end here it looks a little bit odd. It's just because the snapping was 2D. But you know, they're very easy things to fix. I'm not going to worry about that for now. If we enable our cloth and our subdivision surface, you can see that it looks quite nice. There's a little bit of a weird kink on it here. But generally, it seems to be working. Let's grab the time slider and pull this back and see what happens. Okay, and you can see that it's still travelling along the spline. At this point, it's looking really odd because it's all deformed from the morph. But what we can do is we come to this point here, we select our pose morph tag. We need to switch to animate mode, and let's just add a keyframe for the pose at that point at 100%. As we pull back, and we probably only want to go, 10 frames, maybe 12, and let's just take that to 0. You could maybe go back a bit more, and you can see that now our ribbon comes along, and then at that point it morphs into shape. So there's another solution of how we can use this kind of flowing type but achieve very, very specific shapes at the end of the animation. Probably a little bit harsh there, but you need to be careful, because if you take this back too far, no, that's okay. That's probably even better. There you go. So it's a lot more subtle, that morph into shape. You're just getting a little bit of a wobble there. But those are the kind of things that you have to just sit there and tweak until you're happy with the result. And of course, you need to keep checking this against the logo to make sure that everything's correct. So that's another solution. And I've got one more solution for you, which doesn't involve using morphs, because if you have a version of Cinema 4D, for instance, that isn't Studio, you don't get all of the features, and you may not have the pose morph tag, but definitely in the basic version of Cinema you won't. But if you have something that if you have MoGraph but you don't have pose morph, then there's another solution that we can do using MoGraph effectors. For this final solution, we can actually work with parametric objects. So let's hide the polygon object here that we used with the morph, and I'm going to grab R-long02, and let's just enable this. And if we right click on here and choose current state to object, we then get this polygonal version here, and we can use this as a kind of morph target, but we're going to do that with MoGraph. So what I'm going to do next is just hold down Shift, come up to MoGraph, and add in a matrix object. And with that matrix object, if we then choose mode object, because it's a child, it will automatically stick to all the vertices or whatever the distribution is set to here. But we want to set that to vertex, and you can drag the object in here if you don't want the hierarchy to be set up like that. So what we've got here is we have a matrix object which is essentially cloning onto every vertex of this geometry. So we can hide this now, we don't need to see that. Let's take our R-long3, control drag to create a duplicate, and let's call this 05. And let's fold that down and we call this 05. And if we enable this, you can see that this is one that I changed the spline so that this graph doesn't match anymore, but that doesn't really matter because we don't need that. So we can choose animation, delete track, and then just reset that to default. So now if we scrub through, you can see that our ribbon comes into place. So what we want to do is at this point here, we want to kind of morph that onto this matrix object, and we do that using the inheritance effector. So if we select this R-long05, hold down Shift, come to MoGraph, choose effector and add the inheritance effector. Now you want the inheritance effector to actually be after the spline wrap because the order of execution is pretty important here. So if we drag this down and drop this underneath, and this is like a poor man's morph. If you don't have morphing, then this is a workaround that you can use with MoGraph. So what we want to do with this inheritance effector is we want to say, okay, first of all, we want you to be a deformer, because at the moment it's just set as a normal MoGraph effector and it's not going to affect any of the points, polygons or anything on this object. So under the deformer tab, let's set the deformation to be point. Under the effector tab, we need to say which object do we want to inherit our point information from, and we want to inherit that from the matrix object. So we drag that into there like so. Well, as soon as we do that, we get this morph motion object becomes enabled. So if we check that, you can see that as soon as we check that, that morphs our points onto the matrix object, which of course is linked to the vertices on this geometry here. We can now adjust the slider, and you can see we've now created a morph really quickly. And you know, the great thing about this as well is we can include fall off, so we could add some spherical fall off, and now you can see that as I move it around, it only morphs within that fall off area. So that gives you a whole new level of control. So that's a pretty cool feature. Let's just set that back to infinite and uncheck visible so we can't see it. So if we come to frame 75, we select our inheritance effector, switch to the effector tab, let's add a key for our strength at 100, and let's come back. You can see that as we come back, we're not seeing any movement. So what we want to do is switch off the inheritance effector, and there you go. So you do need to be careful, because if we start to inherit those positions from here, the whole thing's going to morph from this position. So you need to do it kind of late on. So it isn't the greatest solution, but sometimes it may be the only option that you have. If we then pull this down to 0 and add a key, so I'm on frame 55, let's enable that inheritance effector, and you can see now as we pull in, it morphs into shape. So perhaps it's a little bit early because we get this movement that we might not want. So let's take this key and just pull this down a little bit closer. So the morph is pretty quick, and I think that's a case of fine-tuning that until you are happy with the result. So it's not quite as smooth as using the actual pose morph tag, but the great thing about a solution such as this is you could grab your spline and you can literally move those points to anywhere you want, and it will still morph onto this object because it's morphing directly onto that geometry, well, onto the matrix object. So there we go. So there's another solution of how you may be able to achieve very specific shapes with your objects as you flow them along a path. And of course this technique is perfectly viable for other times where you may be using a morph. Doesn't have to necessarily involve spline wrap at all, but it might involve other deformers. So I hope you enjoyed the class, and I hope you got some handy tips out of this. If you've got any questions on any of this, please post it on the forums. Other than that, have a great week, and I'll catch you all next time.